I'll start tomorrow. I'll start Monday. I'll start when things settle down. But that's part of the trap too. Overwhelm makes a problem feel massive, and the moment you tell yourself you could deal with it later, you get a little relief. And your brain loves relief, which means it wants you to delay again tomorrow, and the next day, and then the next.
You've tried to quit before. Maybe it worked for a while. Maybe it didn't. But deep down, you know sobriety isn't just about not drinking. It's about finding peace, purpose, and finding yourself again. Welcome to the Sober and Happy Podcast. Each week, Tim shares hard-earned lessons from his own decade of recovery, real talk, real methods, and the mindset that helped him turn the fight of sobriety into a life he actually loves. This is the Sober and Happy Podcast. Now, here's your host, Tim Phillips.
Welcome back to the Sober and Happy Podcast. This week, I want to talk about that moment when you know something has to change, but even thinking about it sends your brain into panic mode, and suddenly it feels like too much. For me, that moment showed up recently around my health. I was at the dentist getting ready for a procedure, and the tech took my blood pressure, and she said, "Whoa, we can't give you anesthesia with your blood pressure this high." That led to a conversation with my doctor, a few weeks of monitoring, and something became clear. These numbers aren't just a little high. You're at a risk of a stroke if we don't do something high. So she put me on medication to bring it down right away. And while I agreed because the situation was serious, I also told her something important. My goal isn't to take medication to treat symptoms of my poor lifestyle choices. I wanted to fix the things that are creating the problem, not just manage it. So along with the prescription came the lifestyle talk, but this time with a lot more urgency. I needed to lose weight, move more, and make some real changes to what I'm eating, especially cutting back on sodium. Now, I love my salt. Hot sauces, Diet Coke, processed food, all the good stuff that isn't good for you. I went home, opened my cupboards, and I started looking at the labels. It seemed like every can, every jar, and every box was loaded with sodium. Then my brain jumped ahead. If I give up Diet Coke, what do I drink when I'm out? What do I order at restaurants? What happens when I go to someone else's house for dinner? In about 30 seconds, I've gone from I need to cut back on sodium to my entire life is about to change and I'm never going to enjoy food again. And before I'd even taken a single step to fix my habits, I was completely overwhelmed and I talked myself into changing tomorrow. Underneath all of that, if I'm being honest, was the fact that food had become one of my go-to ways of coping. After quitting drinking and smoking, I leaned into food as my default coping mechanism. I knew it wasn't great, but the consequences weren't immediate like they were with alcohol. It was easy to use food to take the edge off stress, anxiety, or whatever I didn't want to feel at the moment. So when my doctor started talking about changing my diet, it didn't feel just like tweaking what I eat. It felt like I was losing one of my last escape routes. And if you've ever tried to quit drinking, you probably recognize the pattern I just described. You know something needs to change. You know the way you're coping with it isn't working anymore. But the second you picture what life might look like without that thing, whether it's alcohol, food, or anything else, it feels like too much and your brain wants to shut the whole conversation down. That's what I want to dig into in this episode. Why change feels so overwhelming before we even start. What's actually going on in our heads when that happens, and how to make it feel a lot more doable, one small step at a time. One of the things I've noticed, both in my life and with people I work with, is that overwhelm doesn't happen because the change itself is too hard. It happens because our brains immediately jump from the first step to the entire life that comes after that step. We don't think, okay, what can I do today? We think, what does this mean for the next year or even the next 50 years? And once your brain goes there, it's game over. You're not dealing with the problem anymore. You're dealing with this giant, exaggerated, worst-case scenario version of the problem. That's exactly what happened with me standing in my kitchen. I wasn't thinking, all right, you love hot sauce. Let's see what low-sodium options are out there. My brain jumped straight to, you could never go to a restaurant again. You can't have Diet Coke. You can't enjoy food with friends. Every social situation is going to be awkward. Your whole life is going to change. None of that was actually true, but it didn't matter because once that spiral starts, the overwhelm feels real. And this is so similar to what happens when someone decides to quit drinking. People don't usually get overwhelmed because alcohol is physically impossible to give up. They get overwhelmed because the moment they think about quitting, their mind throws them into the future. What about holidays? What about vacations? What about that wedding I have coming up? What if everyone thinks I'm boring? What if I lose all my friends? What if I slip again? Suddenly, the decision you're making for today becomes a lifelong identity shift you're supposed to manage perfectly forever, and that will overwhelm anybody. The mind is actually trying to help when it does this. It thinks it's preparing you. It thinks it's giving you all the possible problems you might face so you won't be caught off guard. But really, what it's doing is dumping 50 different scenarios on your plate at once, and you're still standing there at step 0 just trying to breathe. So the overwhelm trap is really this. Your brain takes a change that's important and meaningful and already emotionally loaded, and then it drags you into an imagined future where you're responsible for every single version of that change all at once. And because that future is unknown and unpredictable, it feels threatening. That's why even positive changes that will absolutely make your life better, can feel terrifying before you even start. It's not the change itself, it's the story we tell ourselves. And if you're anything like me, once that feeling kicks in, it becomes really tempting to delay. Not quit, not give up, just delay. I'll start tomorrow. I'll start Monday. I'll start when things settle down. But that's part of the trap too. Overwhelm makes a problem feel massive, and the moment you tell yourself you could deal with it later, you get a little relief. And your brain loves relief, which means it wants you to delay again tomorrow, and the next day, and then the next. So if you've ever wondered why you could know exactly what needs to change and still find yourself doing nothing about it, this is why. You're not lazy. You're not unmotivated. You're overwhelmed. And your brain is trying to protect you from a future that doesn't even exist yet. Another thing that makes change feel so overwhelming is something I call identity lag. And what I mean by this, even when you know you need to change something, and even when you're fully capable of doing it, there's still a part of you that's operating based on who you've been for most of your life. Your behavior is ready to change, but your identity hasn't caught up yet. This hit me hard when I started thinking about changing the way I eat, because the truth is, I've always seen myself as the chubby kid. Even during times in my life when I've lost weight, that identity never really shifted. I didn't suddenly start seeing myself as a healthy person or a fit person. I just felt like the chubby kid who was trying to lose weight. And because of that, everything healthy I did back then felt like a temporary performance, and eating healthy felt like a punishment for allowing myself to get fat again. I'd be out with friends, looking at the menu, and everyone would order what they wanted, and I'd get something healthier. And even if I liked what I ordered, there's a part of me that felt like I was missing out, like they were enjoying real food and I was just behaving or following the rules or doing the right thing, but not necessarily the thing that matched who I believe myself to be. And the thing about identity is that it's powerful. It always tries to pull you back to the familiar, even when the familiar isn't good for you. So even now, when I think about eating differently, it doesn't just feel like sorting out my sodium or making a few swaps. It feels like stepping into a version of myself that I haven't fully accepted yet. It's not just the habits that needs to change, it's a story I tell myself about who I am. This is the exact same thing that happens when people quit drinking. They stop drinking, but they still see themselves as the person who used to drink, the one who relied on alcohol in social situations or needed it to loosen up or felt more confident and connected with the drink in their hand. And without alcohol, they don't suddenly feel like a new evolved version of themselves. They usually feel awkward, disconnected, or unsure how to be around people. Even after they've been sober for a while, there's this lag between the new behavior they're building and the old identity they've carried around for years. And that identity lag creates friction. It makes the change feel harder than it actually is, because every choice you make that doesn't match your old identity feels like you're abandoning something familiar. Feels like you're walking away from a version of yourself that you've known for a long time, even if that version was hurting you. So when I think about changing how I eat and my brain freaks out about never having hot sauce again or not knowing what to order when I'm out with my friends, it's not really about the food. It's about letting go of an identity that was developed when I was a kid and that I've carried for 49 years. The identity of using food as comfort. The identity of being the chubby kid. The identity of thinking healthy choices are temporary rather than who I am. And now that's a big shift. And when your mind hasn't made that shift yet, of course it feels overwhelming. You're not just changing your habits, you're redefining yourself. And another thing that adds to all this overwhelm is something most people don't realize they're dealing with, and that's decision fatigue. Decision fatigue isn't just being tired of making choices. It's what happens when every single part of your normal routine suddenly becomes a decision you have to think about. When I started looking at my diet through the lens of sodium and blood pressure, things that used to be automatic suddenly felt complicated. Before, I'd grab whatever sounded good, throw some hot sauce on it, grab a Diet Coke, and not think twice. But now every little thing turned into a question. How much sodium is in this? Is there a better option? Should I eat this? What do I do if I'm hungry but nothing fits into the plan? What do I order when I go out? And your brain could only handle so many questions like that before it gets tired and starts pushing back. Not because it's trying to sabotage you, but because you're forcing it to think about things it used to do on autopilot. You're asking it to be alert and engaged in situations where it's used to being checked out and just coasting. That is why people feel so exhausted in early sobriety too. When you drink, so many things become automatic. How you unwind, how you socialize, how you celebrate, how you cope. There's a drink for stress, a drink for fun, a drink for awkwardness, a drink for Friday, a drink for Tuesday. You don't have to think about it, you just do what you've always done. But once you quit, suddenly everything becomes a decision. How do I relax? What do I do after work? What do I bring to a party? What do I do when someone offers me a drink? Even something as simple as going to the grocery store or planning a night in becomes intentional instead of automatic. And that level of constant decision making will drain anybody. So when you combine identity lag with decision fatigue, it makes perfect sense why the beginning of any change feels like too much. You're not just making new choices, you're replacing dozens of old automatic choices with new ones you have to consciously think about. And until those choices start becoming your new normal, it can be exhausting. That's also why so many people say, I was doing fine and then suddenly I crashed. It's not sudden, it's cumulative. Your brain has been working overtime in the background, and eventually it hits a point where it says, okay, we need a break. And that break often looks like going back to what's familiar. Drinking, overeating, scrolling, numbing, avoiding, not because you're weak, but because your brain is trying to retreat to something that doesn't require effort. The good news is, decision fatigue gets better. The first time you make a new choice, it takes energy. The 10th time, it takes less energy. And eventually it becomes automatic. Your brain rewires, your identity shifts, and the thing that once felt overwhelming becomes part of your everyday life. But in the beginning, you're going to feel that mental load, and knowing why it's happening could take a lot of the shame and confusion out of the process. One of the biggest reasons overwhelm takes over so quickly is because we don't actually know what the first step is. We think we do, but when you look closer, most of us skip right past the beginning and start planning 10 steps ahead. And the moment you jump into the future like that, you will lose all sense of direction. That's what happened to me when I looked into my pantry. I didn't think, okay, what one small change can I make today? I thought, what does this mean for the rest of your life? And once you're in that mindset, there is no clear starting point. Everything feels like step one, and every option feels like the wrong one. And when there's no clear first step, your brain defaults to waiting. I'll start when I have a full plan. I'll start when life calms down. I'll start when I feel ready. But waiting doesn't make the first step clear. It just gives your anxiety more space to build a story around how impossible the whole thing is going to be. This is exactly what people experience when they're thinking about getting sober. They don't get stuck because they don't know what sobriety is. They get stuck because they don't know where to start. Do I go to a meeting? Do I tell my friends? Do I get rid of all the alcohol in my house? What do I do when cravings hit? What do I do on the weekend? And then the big one, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? So if you're trying to solve the rest of your life before you've even taken the first step, of course it feels overwhelming. There's no path, just a giant blurry picture of a future you don't know how to live yet. But the truth is, every meaningful change, sobriety, health, relationships, finances, they all start with something so much smaller than we think. It's not about figuring out the whole plan. It's about identifying one clear, doable action that could move you forward. For me, with the diet stuff, The first real step isn't figuring out how I'll eat at a friend's house or what I'll order at a restaurant next month. The first step is probably something simple, like finding one lower sodium swap that I actually enjoy, or taking a few minutes to read a label that I've never bothered reading before. That's it. It's not glamorous or life-changing on its own, but it's doable. And once that first step is clear, you suddenly have momentum. You're no longer staring at this giant mountain. You're just taking one step on a path, and the path gets clearer with every step you take. So when people start their sobriety journey, one of the first things I tell them is this: don't worry about next week or next month or the wedding you have to go to in 6 months. Just focus on today. What's the one thing you could do today that supports the person you're trying to become? Once you know that, overwhelm doesn't disappear, but it becomes more manageable. It stops being this giant storm of I can't do this and starts becoming a series of simple decisions you could actually handle. Clarity is the cure for overwhelm, and clarity always starts with one small obvious step that you've been too overwhelmed to notice. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea that you need to feel motivated before you can make a change. And I think this belief stops more people than anything else. We wait for that spark or that perfect moment or that wave of energy where we suddenly want to do all the things we've been putting off. But here's the truth. Motivation is almost never there at the beginning. When I got those blood pressure readings, I didn't suddenly feel fired up to overhaul my diet, start exercising, and making different choices. I wasn't inspired. I wasn't excited. I wasn't thinking, all right, let's do this. Honestly, I felt the opposite. I felt overwhelmed, annoyed, stressed, and frustrated because I didn't want to have to deal with this. I wanted things to go back to normal. But that's the trap. We wait to feel ready, and meanwhile, the situation doesn't magically improve. My blood pressure wasn't going to come down just because I didn't feel motivated yet. And for anyone listening who's trying to quit drinking or make another big change, your life doesn't wait for motivation either. The consequences will keep coming whether you feel ready or not. And if anyone understands how unreliable motivation is, it's people who've had bad drinking nights. After a horrible night, the kind where you wake up sick, embarrassed, ashamed, you're incredibly motivated. You swear off drinking forever, and you mean it. In that moment, you feel more motivated than you ever have. And then what happens? By that evening or the next day, that motivation is gone. You're drinking again. Not because you didn't care, not because you're weak, but because motivation is temporary. It fades faster than we want to believe. That is why relying on motivation for long-term change is a losing game. Motivation isn't what starts change. It's what shows up after you start. It comes from seeing progress, from feeling better, from proving to yourself that you could do the thing that you didn't think you could do. But at the beginning is usually uncomfortable. It's awkward. It feels forced. You feel unsure. Sometimes you even feel angry about it. And that's okay. That's normal. The beginning of a change is supposed to feel like that. I didn't walk into my pantry feeling inspired to eat differently. I just knew I needed to take one small step. Not all of them, just one. And once I took that step, maybe the next one feels a little easier, and then the next one. And eventually my identity catches up, the decisions become easier, and the overwhelm quiets down. The same thing happens in sobriety. People don't quit because they wake up one day overflowing with motivation. They quit because they're tired of the consequences. They quit because they're tired of who alcohol turned them into. They quit because something in them says, I can't keep doing this. And then, once they start taking steps, the motivation grows, and not a moment before. So if you're sitting here waiting for motivation, whether it's to stop drinking, start eating healthier, exercising, learning how to set boundaries, getting help, whatever it is, you're going to be waiting a long time. You don't need motivation to start. You just need a step that's small enough that you could actually take it. Motivation is the effect, not the cause. And the biggest shift for me, especially with this blood pressure stuff, is accepting that I don't have to want to change in order to start. I just have to care enough about my future self to take the next step, even if it's small, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it feels like I'm doing it badly. Because the truth is, most massive changes begin the same way, with someone who didn't feel ready taking a step anyway. So if you're listening to all of this and you're seeing your own story in it, whether it's around food, drinking, your health, or any part of your life you've been wanting to change, I hope the biggest takeaway is simply this. Nothing is wrong with you. You're not overwhelmed because you're weak or broken or because you just can't get it together. You're overwhelmed because your brain is trying to protect you. It's trying to keep you safe from the unknown. And it does that by dragging you into the future, holding on to old identities, and making you question every decision. But the truth is, change doesn't happen in the future. It doesn't happen in the new identity. It doesn't happen in the perfect plan where everything goes smoothly. Change happens in tiny, imperfect steps you're willing to take today, even when you don't feel ready. That's where everything begins. And I know that first step feels small. It might even feel pointless, but the small steps are the ones that build your new life. The overwhelm fades, the decisions get easier, your identity shifts, and one day you look back and realize you're living the life you wanted, not because you were motivated, but because you kept taking steps that were small enough to do. So here's my challenge for you this week, and I want you to actually do this. Pick one thing, just one, that moves you even half an inch towards the person you're trying to become. Not 10 things, not a complete life overhaul, just one. Whatever it is, make it small enough that you can actually do it today, not tomorrow, not someday. Because the moment you take that step, you break the cycle. You prove to your brain that you could move forward. And once you do that, everything else becomes just a little bit easier. Thank you for spending time with me today. If this episode helped you, or if you know someone who's feeling stuck or overwhelmed, please share it with them. And as always, I'm proud of you for showing up, for being here, for listening, and wanting more from yourself. I'll see you next week, and until then, keep living sober and happy.
Thanks for listening to the Sober and Happy podcast with Tim Phillips. If today's episode connected with you, share it with someone who needs it. You can follow Tim on social at I Am Sober and Happy and visit soberandhappy.com for tools, motivation, and more episodes. Remember, quitting drinking is just the beginning. The real goal is learning to love yourself and love your life. This has been the Sober and Happy podcast. See you next time.